From the Global Environmental Justice Observatory at the University of California, Santa Cruz, welcome to Liminal Spaces with our host, Professor Ravi Rajan.
Our guest today is Grear, a professor of law at the Cardiff University School of Law and Politics. Dr. Grear is a founder as well as editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Human Rights and the Environment. She has also worked extensively as a director of the Global Network for the Study of Human Rights and the Environment until 2017. This is the second half of a two-part interview with Professor Grear. In the first part, we discussed her work relating human rights and the environment with the legal subjectivity of non-human entities. That podcast also brought up points that Professor Grear made in a more recent publication with David Bollier entitled The Great Awakening, New Modes of Life Amidst Capitalist Ruins. This week's episode focuses on Dr. Grear's thoughts on new materialist thought and serving as a resistance to neoliberalism, as well as the role of Eurocentricity within international courts amidst our current age of the capitalocene. To learn more about Anna Grear's research, please follow the links in the podcast description.
Let's explore these ideas a bit more if we can. You write that, to quote, present and future needs can be met by systems that go beyond the market and the state. You also write about finding new modes of life among the capitalist ruins. Mm-hmm. So once again, whilst offering a very pointed critique of contemporary global capitalist systems, one of the features of your work is that you also come back and offer a range of really interesting and rich alternatives. Could you probably elaborate on some of the landscape of these alternatives when it comes to economic systems?
I mean, I'm not an expert on this. I have worked alongside people who are, but there are all sorts of imaginative things happening. I mean, in the city where I live, Bristol, in the United Kingdom, we have our own local currency. We have the Bristol pound, and the thinking behind that is that by spending Bristol pounds, you keep the money in the local economy, and only certain shops trade in Bristol pounds. So the independent traders, the local traders who have networks of relations with the local community, who supply business to local organic farmers, for example, and support their efforts to support a regenerative economy. The idea is that the currency itself circulates those networked relations, protecting them from the large supermarkets, the large impersonal globalized forces that also operate in the city. So there are ways of setting up and hacking and reimagining initiatives, both economic and legal. Was that the sort of thing you had in mind?
Well, I was referring to an actual quote that you had, which said that, to state it again, that present and future needs to be met by going beyond the market and the state. And I was just trying to understand what you meant.
That might have been in the context of the book I co-edited with David Bollier. Is that? Yes. So that would be David. David is a fantastic commons scholar, and he's spent a lot of time working on this. My interest is more in the kind of onto-epistemological dimensions of that. So for me, I'm more interested in looking at how you get ontological justice, how you create many worlds within the world in which we live, a world that can tolerate multiple worlds and multiple ways of being. David is much better at all the kind of technical, practical stuff that he's been working on for a long time. So yeah, that's not actually my voice, that's my dear friend David's voice.
Maybe we can go to something else that you mentioned, which is related. You talk about what you call the new materialist thought.
Yes.
In resisting to neoliberalism. Could you perhaps say something about that, please?
Yeah, I don't know if new materialism intrinsically resists neoliberalism. I think we can think of new materialism in ways that does resist neoliberalism. So new materialism is a broadly post-humanist theory that is both post-humanist, in other words, it's post-humanism. Humanism set up the human central figure at the centre of its concerns, and post-humanism rejects that human centrality and moves beyond humanism. And it's also post-anthropocentric in the sense that it looks at the agency of the more than human, the non-human, the other than human. And Posthumanism and new materialism are closely related fields. Rosie Braidotti, who's a leading posthumanist, describes herself as a neo-materialist, and then writers such as Jane Bennett, who are hardcore new materialists, although she doesn't use that phrase of herself, have been described as posthumanists. So we don't need to kind of get into the niceties of the debates around that. But the central insight is it's not just about humans anymore. These theories respond to several realities. They respond to the destructive, power-soaked nature of where we've got to, and the destructiveness of centralising the human, and the nature of the neoliberal global economy. They respond to new developments in cutting-edge sciences that actually blur the boundary of the human and the machine. They look at things like biotechnology and new developments that actually make it really difficult to say in some circumstances where the human ends and where the human begins, that infinitely complicate the notion of the human. And they respond also to the need to value materiality itself. So they step back against the linguistic turn that argued that everything's constructed by language. It was a rediscovery of the importance of materiality itself. And what's new about it, I suppose, is its alliance with these new sciences. Jane Bennett's quite clear that she doesn't reject the old materialisms, but that she supplements the old materialisms with an unerring focus on the distributed agency that is made up by humans and non-humans in collective working groups. So new materialism decenters the human from the centre of the picture and decenters the human itself, because the human emerges in that story as multi-layered. We understand the microbial communities that make us up. We understand the porous boundaries between our skin and the environment. We understand Stacey Alamo's terms, the notion of transcorporeality, the idea that all bodies are somehow porous and that there are drifts and vectors and movements of nutrients and toxins and forces across the planet that, water being one, that move through bodies, that are changed in that process, that move into the earth again, and that these movements have significance agentically, that there's no longer an inert matter and a human actor. There is a thoroughly material, embodied human self of a complex kind that exists in a world of matter as materialization, dynamic process, forms of becoming that we can't even necessarily see with our unaided sight, because the temporalities of these things move at different scales maybe to human temporalities, but which nonetheless are forceful, real actants in the world, have agentic force. So that's kind of where new materialism lands. And for me, that's a much, much more epistemically faithful, empirically rich way of looking at the world. It's a much more realistic way of looking at who's here. And it's a much more exciting starting point for thinking about who matters and why, and what kind of valuations we make. It's a radically different foundation for thinking than the kind of thinking we're used to. And so it sounds to many people who are not familiar with it kind of crazy and mind-blowing. But once you really get into it, you begin to understand how fecund it is, how loaded with possibility for a new kind of imaginary, for imagining new kinds of normative relations, and actually for some convergences with indigenous and more ancient and spiritual modes of thinking.
Indeed, what you describe is really a very, very exciting time that we're living in for the future of humanities in general, not just environmental humanities. There's such interesting pathways ahead of us. And thank you for being a pioneer in that. But you've also written powerfully about the marginalization of race, class, and particularly indigenous peoples in your critique of the global system, and including legal theory. Could you tell us a bit more, particularly about how you think gender and race influences what you describe as legal privileges that produce or reproduce the hierarchical spectrum of constructive rationality and irrationality?
Yes.
Just to pick up earlier thread.
Yes, so it comes back really to those questions of what kind of subject has been assumed by law. And if we look back, if we look into the foundations of the international legal order, as people like Anthony Anghie argue, we find colonialism. And colonialism, certainly in its European form, assumed a civilizational mission based around this idea of the rational hierarchical superiority of the European. But that European was largely imprinted on these related constructs around masculine public reason and discourse. White European women, yes, they were part of the civilizing mission, but they were very much subjected at home to the primacy of the white European property-owning male. And a large driver, of course, of colonialism was European hunger for raw materials, for natural resources. And of course, as is infamous, Europeans developed legal doctrines to effectively sanction their plunder of pre-existing indigenous world. So when Europeans arrived in Australia, the Aborigines there were not recognised as having any prior legally meaningful relationship with the land. And the common law doctrine of res nullius, empty thing, empty land, was developed precisely to rationalise the imposition of European conceptions of property and agency that should count for law, whereby sovereignty and property were exercised by the imposition of those European legal constructs. Race and gender and those kind of forms of othering are inextricably linked to where we are. And this pushback against the so-called woke agenda, and I can't comment on some of the extremes of that because I'm not based in the States, but I hear people talking a lot about how extreme it is and all that. I'm speaking as a situated British person. There is no doubt that even though we have some progress on the rights of women, and even though some people can be trotted out to show that certain people of colour do very well, thank you very much, within the existing system, none of that displaces the power and the potency of these structures that still subtend the legal system and its arrangements to a significant degree. And one key example of that critical legal theorists have really pulled out is the race and gender of the corporate form, which sounds crazy, but when you actually analyse the suppositions that inform corporate law and inform the kind of disembodied, rational, accumulative sovereignty of the corporate form, you notice the very strong reticulation with suppositions around laws, what Narin Nafeen calls laws darling, the disembodied, Eurocentric, white, rationalist, property-owning, masculinist construct at the centre of the legal system, the epistemic master whose ways of knowing are then forced onto the world that he, inverted commas, because it's a construct, pushed his colonising aspirations, destroying indigenous ontologies, disrupting indigenous epistemologies, rupturing pre-existing relations between humans and non-human nature, and all the rest of it, that the long, sorry story of capitalist colonialism actually reveals to us to almost genocidal levels. So yes, all these things to me converge, and they converge most fundamentally in the most profound layers of the subterranean commitments of law that don't get explicitly spoken about necessarily, but are nonetheless operative in the legal system at a profound level. And it's the job of legal theorists to pull those out, to expose them, to think about how they could be deconstructed, to think about alternative imaginaries. And it's exciting to see judges, whether consciously or not, opening to new imaginaries in new creative judgments that have the potential to push back against these suppositions, but sometimes fail to. So even where rights of nature have been granted, for example, extractivism still goes on. Neoliberal priorities are still pursued. And that's got a lot to do with the structure of the global system and the fact that the international legal order was, in a sense, designed for the benefit of the global north over the global south. And we still see those structural relations in play today.
What do you see as the impact of the various organizations, social movements, etc., that we have raising particularly these sort of genocidal implications of climate change in this kind of early, I would say, Anthropocene. What do you think are the prospects of this kind of widespread social concern? And I want to segue to a small addendum to that, if I may, and that is corporations today make a great deal about being careful about the use of resources. I just saw an ad from a clothing company that talked about buying few clothes and not buying too many, just buying their clothes. Essentially, you might have seen that ad. So there's a lot of, such kind of posturing, claiming to be environmentally responsible. It's almost a thing to say now. But to what extent do you think that these kinds of moves are resonant to the kinds of critiques that you're saying? And to what extent do you see a bigger shift in the arrangements that we have about the economic system, conceptions of rights, et cetera, in the upcoming years?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm quite hopeful, actually, about social movement activisms. My sense is that there is a growing and shifting consciousness as more and more people become aware of precisely how profound and real the threats from the climate crisis are. I don't think everyone's joining the dots yet to the dominance of the existing system and, for example, its industrial animal food production practices and other things that we should link to the genesis of the current crisis. But nonetheless, I think there is a sign of a genuinely shifting consciousness. And of course, corporations, there are different kinds of corporations. There are new, lean, hungry, ethical visionaries producing new ways of doing business, which again can be very hopeful. Whether or not that will in the end add up to sufficient system change, I mean, there's nothing wrong with market exchange, is there, per se? No one wants to demonize that per se. The problem is the embedded structural situation that we're in, whereby I think something like 75%, it could be the wrong figure, of all greenhouse gas emissions were produced by 100 companies or something like that. So clearly we have corporations or large transnational corporations that are egregious offenders in this field. And then we have an array of what we could think of as social movement market relations, whereby we have this whole realm of imaginative hacks going on, commons-based initiatives, new independent currencies, different modes of exchange, and so on. That's all very hopeful. I suppose for me, the only question is, what do we do about these sedimented power structures in place, whereby an increasingly small number of people and groups have increasing levels of disproportionate economic power? And we've seen it, haven't we, in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, where some individuals have made billions and billions of pounds and dollars out of the situation. And there's a real question there about the future of democracy. There is a quasi-authoritarian shift. Certainly in Britain, we have an utterly corrupt, quasi-authoritarian leaning government that, in its manifesto even talked about reining in the power of the courts. I heard an absolutely superb speech recently by a professor who studies authoritarian societies, who argued that Britain is right up there with places like Hungary, where you have lip service paid to democracy and a strong calling on electoral popular will, but actually the democratic institutions that keep basic forms of political distributive relationship in place are being eroded and destroyed. And a real question is, how do we break the power that this kind of plutocratic dynamic is now exhibiting in a wide range of situations and political arrangements? And, I think it's Samuel Moyne who makes the point that neoliberalism has blasted the ceiling on inequality right off. So while human rights and other movements might be looking at let's supply basic needs, and we have to do that, the level of ambition on socio-economic rights is so low, it's so minimalist, it's a flaw. Meanwhile, the ceiling on inequality is completely blown off, which has a radically destabilizing effect on democracy, as we've seen in the United States, as we're seeing in Britain, as we're seeing in multiple other societies. And that I find really disturbing. And I don't know I don't really know what the answer is. In Britain, for example, we need electoral reform. We have a system that systematically tilts the field in favour of the dominant party. So all these things, all these strands come together and they interact in complex ways. How we unpick them, how we resist, I suspect is going to have to be a multiplicity. I think every initiative is worth taking. I don't see the need for a massive transnational organisational effort. I don't see it as binary, one force against another. I think the situation we're in is incredibly complex, which in itself gives me hope that these smaller initiatives, the signs of hope, actually are meaningful, provided the existing system doesn't crush them by force of law and through techno-surveillance.
To move on to some of the kind of transformative work you've actually done. You've obviously done, as you articulated, a lot of critical thinking on these subjects, but you've also been a major pioneer in making a difference. In particular, you were the founder of the Global Network for Environmental Human Rights, which is now more than a decade old, and it's drawn a tremendous amount of energy and enthusiasm from scholars and practitioners from every corner of the world. Can you please tell us a bit about this initiative, what it has done so far, and what do you think the potential is in the years to come?
Yeah, that initiative sprang up at the same time as I founded the journal, actually. And the global network idea was the idea of the journal was to create a discursive space in which scholars could engage with human rights and environmental issues. And we deliberately combine critical and doctrinal and other forms of scholarship so that scholars encounter different ways of thinking, and it expands the conversation. That's one of our ambitions. And the global network was an attempt to extend that initially and to create a network whereby people could connect via a website and also on Mail and communicate with each other about, initiatives they were taking or events they were holding, seminars and so on. And so one of the first initiatives we undertook was to create a research repository. And we tried to gather as many of the existing pieces of work on human rights and environment and relevant to those fields and their intersection as we could. And that went on with, we had some quite radical conferences and publications early on. I stepped back in about 2016 because I actually got really ill and I didn't want my lack of energy to hold back the network. And so it's been taken on since by the incredibly capable Erin Daly, who's taken it in a slightly different direction. She's organised it better, which is great. She's kind of sorted that out. I'm a bit, kind of on the fly. She's made it much more steady in that sense, and she's broadened the regional representation. So she's got offices for various parts of the globe, and she has made much stronger links with things like the UN because she was already so well networked and such an esteemed scholar in the field. And so from where I'm sitting, it's just gone from strength to strength. I have no criticism to offer. My longing would be that the critical edge is also retained as the GNHRE articulates more closely with the official bodies. As a critical legal theorist, I'm always a little bit like, okay, don't want to get too embroiled in the kind of official structures, but I think actually what they're doing is really, really good and a vital point of reticulation between the more radical possibilities of scholarship and the more established policy approaches and legal approaches of the existing structures.
Last but by no means least, a number of young people listening to this podcast contemplate careers in environmental law. We've had a number of our students pursue these careers over the years that I've been teaching. Your work, though, is a significant departure from the conventional trajectories of environmental law that people go into. Can you please tell those of our listeners who might be intrigued and excited about what you just said about the opportunities and possibilities for building careers working along the lines of the ideas that you've been articulating here, please?
Man, that is an interesting question because a lot of environmental law is very ambivalent in its relation to power. And, obviously environmental justice critiques often point to environmental law and say that it legitimates forms of injustice. So it's quite possible to be an environmental lawyer and take quite a technical approach and serve the underlying agendas very well. So my first encouragement to young people thinking of getting into environmental law is go beyond shit click. law practice and think critically, be a radical lawyer, step outside the paradigm, question what you do, question what it is you're getting into. And then, of course, there are presumably, I'm not an environmental lawyer, as you can probably tell, but there are many opportunities, I'd imagine, to be lawyers for imaginative litigation efforts, to learn from lawyers working in other paradigms, lawyers representing Indigenous voices and cosmovisions, lawyers representing environmental justice movements and struggles, lawyers representing social movement actors. One key area will be defending the civil and political rights of those who protest. That is often overlooked. Defending environmental defenders who are being killed at an extraordinary rate, finding ways of actually allowing those people to count for the legal system in a much more meaningful way. I think my plea to young lawyers would be, use your undoubted intellectual skill in a passion for justice, and always, always, always question your own assumptions, the assumptions of the milieu in which you operate, to stay imaginative, to stay pressing the boundaries of the possible, to stay imagining how what you do can serve the search for new arts of co-living on this damaged but beautiful planet. That would be my plea, I think.
Professor Grear, it's been great to have you join us. This conversation has been stimulating, and we look forward to hearing more and talking more with you in due course. Thank you so very much again.
Well, thank you. It's been a privilege.
This podcast was produced and engineered by Audrey Peshkam. Thank you to the members of the production team, Sarah Luna, Andrea Morales, and Dominic Constance. Special thanks to Caitlin Schult, the journal's chief editor, and Sean McHugh, our website editor, for supporting our efforts. Lastly, thank you to Sky Jordan for providing us with their song, Anthem of World Peace, as the music for this podcast. This podcast has been produced by student interns. We have opportunities of volunteering and internship for undergraduates from all over the world. If you are interested in getting involved in the fight for environmental justice, you can contact us at globalejj@gmail.com. For more updates and information on the Global Environmental Justice Observatory and upcoming podcasts, check out our website, globalenvironmentaljustice.org. All our podcasts are available through the website, as well as through our SoundCloud page available at soundcloud.com/GEJ Observatory_UCSC. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another episode of Liminal Spaces.